Thank you. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce today's keynote speaker. But first, speaking of the weather, when I called home last night, my husband informed me it was actually colder here yesterday than in Siberia. So, just a fun fact. Well, I was extremely pleased when Robert Mislevy accepted our invitation to come here and be our keynote speaker. I knew that he would come with some words of wisdom for this community that would challenge us to work even harder to do high quality research. And so I'm really glad that he's here. I'm just going to use my notes to make sure I don't miss anything important to say about him. There's so much to say. But Bob is a Frederick M. Lord Chair in Measurement and Statistics at ETS and Emeritus Professor of Measurement and Statistics at the University of Maryland. And he's well known for attacking hard problems and achieving real-world impact by applying theories and technologies of statistics to education. I've known about his work for a very long time because his name frequently comes up in conversations at Carnegie Mellon University whenever the topic of formal assessment is raised, which is very frequent, actually, among my colleagues. And I have to say, I've been at Carnegie Mellon long enough that I consider it really a home, and so I can say that Bob Mislevy is really a household word. He developed the plausible values methodology for the National Assessment of Educational Progress and worked with Cisco Systems to develop simulation-based assessments of network engineering, and with Linda Stenberg and Russell Almond created an evidence-centered assessment design framework. He has been extremely successful in his career and has received career contribution awards from the American Educational Research Association and the National Council on Measurement and Education, and 3 times received NCME's award for technical contributions to measurement. He's a past president of the Psychometric Society and a member of the National Academy of Education. So we are extremely lucky to have him here to give us some words today, and I hope everyone will listen very carefully to the message that he brings to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. It's great to be here. There are clearly a lot of overlaps and interest between psychometrics and learning analytics, interest in what we can learn from noisy data about people's capabilities to put it, hopefully, to some good use. I would say that in some ways, learning analytics is about 100 years behind psychometrics. In other ways, psychometrics is about 100 years behind learning analytics. So my mission is to shave a couple years, I hope, off either end of that. Now, most people have never heard of the word psychometrics. If you look it up in the dictionary, one of the definitions you'll see is psychometrics is the psychic ability to get impressions of people by holding some object that belongs to them. And that's much cooler than the things that I can actually do. So I'll just talk about what I know about. Most people who do know anything about it thinks that it means you sit around, you write test items that look like this, then you compute item statistics and generate scores and calculate reliabilities from data that looks something like this. You want to know what test that's from? Guess what? Doesn't matter. In almost all the applications of large-scale test theory, now there's a lot more in psychometrics than large-scale test theory, but this is probably the most visible one and the one that has most impact on people's daily lives. What is being done is work that is under what I would call the standard psychometric paradigm, and that is the aim to, quote, measure some construct, usually framed in trait or behavioral psychology. I'll tell you what I mean by that. Trait psychology is, I would like to measure people's reading comprehension ability, and you would do that by having them make a number of inferences from text that they read. Framed in behavioral psychology, that is, well, you define this domain of kinds of tasks that you would like your students at the end of your algebra course to do, and take some sample of those and say, okay, how well are you doing in that domain? So that's how typically constructs have been developed, usually just one single number, one single measure. Every one of those bits of information from a task like that is usually contributing just one number to that data stream. A test score is usually just some aggregation of those things, often a simple sum or average, sometimes a little bit fancier, like item response theory, like we'll talk about in a minute. But the thing is that, yeah, this is what you usually see. This is fairly straightforward. There's a lot of things that it doesn't tell you about. But on the other hand, in the course over the 100 years of trying to tackle and understand really how you get evidence, how you use it, what are the qualities of that evidence, where can you go wrong in your inferences, some really keen insights have come about. Big problem is that at the beginning of psychometrics, people like Thurstone, Cattell, Spearman were at the forefront at the same time of psychology, data and modeling, and of inference, and of statistics, ways of modeling it. Over the years, for large-scale uses, there's been a lot of progress along the lines of the statistical analysis and the reasoning from evidence, and much less progress, not keeping up to date, I would have to say, in terms of the psychology, the understanding of how people learn and the nature of their capabilities, or of the technologies that are now available and the data that you can get from it. So that's the place where psychometrics is trying to catch up. Big part of my job at ETS is trying to bridge that gap there. So what I'll talk about today is some of the kinds of work that we're doing, and along the way, telling you about some of the things that we're working on now, which is trying to take some of the insights, some of the implicit wisdom in psychometrics that has been frozen inside particular methods, particular processes that are still hooked back to the kinds of psychology in the data that psychometrics evolved in, for the most part, and how you bust those out of there and apply them to challenges that are cast in terms of a more recent understanding of people's capabilities and how they develop, and the kinds of technology we can have for examinees to interact in, the uses that we can put it to moment by moment, not necessarily, okay, we give a test and then 6 months later you get your score, and the kinds of rich data that can come out, not just little one number per item per person, but continuous interactions, heart rate as you're going along, eye focus, all the kinds of data that are possible to capture now. So here's an example of one of the kinds of assessments that we've worked on more recently. And the methods from psychometrics really don't apply when you've got assessments that look like this. This is a short clip from, it's a formative assessment. It's in the area of systems thinking. From time to time we'll refer to that. It's called SimCity EDU, Pollution Challenge, and it's in the SimCity environment. And students work on a series of challenges that increasingly, step by step, get them thinking to solve problems, more and more advanced challenges in what systems are doing. Events having multiple effects, for example, or multiple causes. The phenomena of unintended consequences. So our target for a game like this with those kind of ideas is middle school students and policymakers. Okay, so.
Now this time, I'm thinking, that kind of destructive method didn't go so well for me. So maybe, if I know that there's going to be a power problem, maybe I should look at where the power is coming from in the city. All those coal plants are producing my power as well, but maybe if I make another power supply and then destroy the coal plants, that'll go a bit better for me. So I'm going to create this solar plant. It's very expensive. It kind of cost me almost all of my money. And it takes some time, and it also doesn't work at night. So I'm starting to think, this power and air pollution problem is not quite so simple as I was thinking.
Right, and in the real world, that turns out to be the problem too. Now, the data that you get looks something more like this. And as we'll talk about, this is data, but it's already gone through a couple steps of thinking. Doing something like SimCity, one of the things that was fun working on this project is that in order to make this thing work, we had people like learning scientists, people who were teachers, we had researchers, science education researchers who were telling us about the systems thinking aspect of it, systems programmers, psychometricians as well, and our job as psychometricians was to help figure out in this complex environment where students are acting interactively, following different paths, using different strategies to try to figure out these problems, going down these totally different ways of trying to solve it, what do we see there as evidence about their understanding and their strategies about these underlying concepts in systems so that we can evaluate and give them feedback to them and to their teachers. So a couple things that I will mention right now before I go on. We had a number of people working together in the team. Just figuring out how to talk with one another was a big challenge. We did that through this framework of assessment arguments. We'll look at some of those later. Another thing that's really important that when I read some of the learning analytics articles, see some of the talks today, a thing that was really important to us to make this work was lots of iterations, this interplay between design and discovery. You think you know something, you try it out with kids, and guess what? It doesn't happen like you think. You go back and you keep refining, and all the time, what's helping you think about this is your view of what systems thinking is. Then what do you need to have in that environment to evoke that kind of thinking, make kids discover as they work through these problems what's happening in that city. What are the affordances that you can provide them, what they can do in that environment that at the same time move the game forward. The game designers had to really think hard about that, and at the same time gives us clues about their thinking, and at the same time enables them to learn more about what the system is and how to think about it in terms of systems concepts. So I'll go back to some of the ideas in this that came out of the standard ed measurement paradigm that we want to be able to bust free from there and put to work in problems like SimCity. And one of them is probability-based reasoning. This is sort of a big insight maybe 70, 50 years ago in psychometrics, figuring out how to move from the kinds of tests that it was gainfully applied to much more fluid situations like we have now. Let's see, I was going to say, I have 3 words for you, 4 words. Knowledge-based model construction. I guess in German, though, that would be just one word to say to you. So I have those words that I have said. Count them however you want. But probability-based reasoning is going to play a big role in what we do. You'll see what I'll start out with is how these things played out in very simple data, very simple problems, but you can start to see the hooks that we're going to be able to do a lot more with them. Another one that came out of psychometrics was this idea of building models about what your data is really supposed to be about. You see some data, but data is not the same as evidence. Evidence is data as it tells you about some inference you want to make, some work that you want to put it to. And so how you build models that help you structure your thinking about data. Now, when you do this, and anything that has to do with learning or people's capabilities, that can only happen through some lens, some psychological theory of the nature of capabilities as you're interested in them, and with some type of data that you're going to be working with. Those are two of the places that psychometrics did really well with the kinds of trait behavioral psychological lens and the kinds of data that we saw before. And so now a challenge is building models for psychological theories. I'll say a little bit more about this later, but Paul said a lot about that yesterday, so I don't have to say that much. But also data that are rather different, and how you make models so those things cohere with one another. So again, I'll emphasize this interplay back and forth among theory, data, and modeling. Iterative design, having the feedback. I look around and I see some of you people are really happy because you work in projects where you have that opportunity. There's data, there's understanding, there's modeling, there's going back to improve the data that you get, or your models, or the system that you're working in. That's when you learn the best and you learn the fastest. And people who are unhappy, someone else generates data and they throw it over the wall and they say, I hope you can make sense with it. There's lots of it, so I'm sure the answer is there somewhere. And then another thing that's important enough that this will come up a couple times in my talk. This is a quote from Sam Messick, and he said that validity, reliability, comparability, generalizability, fairness, those aren't just measurement issues, but they're social values that whenever you're making evaluative judgments or decisions about people, these things have meaning and they hold force. That's certainly true in large-scale, high-stakes testing, and you're become quite aware of that, partly because of your human responsibility, and partly because when you are neglectful, you get sued. And that's only halfway a joke, because when you look at the history of large-scale assessment, some real advances in fairness, in openness, and being aware for alternative explanations have come about through lawsuits. I've had opinions back and forth about whether I should make this joke. I'm going to go ahead and do it. These things have turned out to be very important in large-scale testing. And I'm going to be very happy if you folks in learning analytics take them seriously and pursue them as well. I'll also be happy if you don't, because I'll be an expert witness to the people who are going to be suing you when you do a bad job. Okay, a little bit more about this standard ed measurement paradigm here. The psychology, this comes about laying a more scientific, a measurement framework of the, say around 1900, over 2,000 years of what you might call the examination paradigm. The examination paradigm, some experts make tasks, people act in them, and the experts make decisions. And that's it. Judges' decisions are final. There might be some pretty complex inference going on evaluating those performances, but it's in the judge's head. It's all implicit. And the idea of laying measurement over that is the idea of, well, what we see, that may not be exactly what we're most interested in. And you find that out when you do something twice and you don't get the same answer. There's another joke that I no reason not to say this one, except maybe it's not all that funny. But it is that most people only think about measurement error when their score is lower than they think that it ought to be. Okay, and in that work, the early applications, there was not too much attention paid to the underlying cognition in the modeling or in the learning process. It was more looking at performance at some decision point, usually. The data, I've already mentioned that there are sometimes human ratings of possibly quite complex performances or products that came out, but judges, human judges evaluating them, coming out with something like a set of numbers, like that flat file that we saw, that's what you come out with. So there's a lot of complexity hidden. If you're ever going to be doing things like automated scoring or scaling up, you can't get away with, well, all right, we'll just get 20,000 judges all the time. You have to start to dig into what is really happening there. What are the qualities of work that are important, and why are they? The idea of objective scoring, things like multiple choice test items, they did scale better. That was a big improvement over completely subjective judges' rating, but there's a serious cost in that. It really constrains the environment, the observational situations, and the richness of performance that you're able to capture. So what we're going to look for, something like in SimCity U, you're trying to look for a blend of both of these things. You're trying to get something that scales. You're trying to be able to make sense to some degree of what people are doing in complex situations, yet do it in a way that has a certain relation that you can point to, that you can leverage about what's important to know and how you know it when you see it in the situations where it ought to be applied. Models, say a couple of comments about that. There's this point that, that at the beginning, the folks who were inventing this were tackling problems jointly in psychology, modeling, statistics. Over the years in psychometrics, a lot of progress in the statistics, in the evidentiary reasoning, not nearly as much in the psychology and the technology. Then I'll also say, as point of interest, back 100 years ago, a lot of what was going on in these early explorations, that's early data mining, with what was, at that time, the biggest data people had ever seen, and the invention of techniques, many of which we still use today and have expanded on, but are at the heart of our thinking, are built into a lot of things that in learning analytics take core ideas and extend them. But things like cluster analysis, factor analysis, path diagrams came up at that point in time. All right. Here's another quote as we start to move into probability-based reasoning that is one of my favorites, that probability isn't really about numbers. It's about the structure of your reasoning. Yes, there are some numbers, but the numbers only make sense in terms of some argument, some assumptions, some relationships that you posit are there. You can build probability models to manage your thinking about the relationships of what you see, how they are, or you can surprise yourself, might not be related to what you want to make inferences about. And so thinking about probability like that makes you quite aware that, if you had thought that original test theory didn't have any psychology in it, or whatever models you're using don't have any assumptions about the nature of learning, well, you're wrong. They're in there, except you just are not aware of them. But they affect the inferences that you're going to make. So one of the big advances, I would say, is being aware that the models that you're using, probability models, have a lot of advantages, but they're like fire. A lot of advantages, but you can burn yourself. You can make mistakes. You need to be aware that all the models, all the probabilities, no matter how fancy they are based on a structure of reasoning. So trying to make that reasoning more explicit and more shareable is really important. That also turned out to be very important in applications like SimCity EDU, where you need to learn to talk with one another, and things that other people know a lot about that you don't, that needs to come together. Standard ed measurement paradigm, very simple picture, very simple idea, very simple mathematics, but rather profound difference from the examination paradigm. And the notion is that what you see, these X's, isn't exactly what you're interested in. What you're interested is some, I'll call it theta here because theta doesn't have any inherent meaning. That's a construct We talked before about trait, behavioral casting of constructs. One switch that we'll see coming ahead is, where is theta? And 100 years ago, people would say, well, yeah, theta's in the head. At that time, it was thought to be in the head of the examinee, in the head of the student. And you can get pretty far with that. I no longer think that's true. I'll also say that if you don't believe it, you probably are doing a better job of using models as if it were true. The as if is really important because it makes you more aware that you're reasoning with a model that isn't the same as reality, and it could go wrong in certain ways that are unfair or improper inferences about people. So here's the idea. This simple structure underlies classical test theory, item response theory. The idea is that this theta, what you really care about but can't see, is driving probabilities of what you might see in the real world. And you take different looks and you get different answers. If you only have one of them, just this idea of what you see and what you care about, it's a nice idea. It really starts to become a useful idea when you have some multiple observations and you have some structure posited, that with that structure, you can do a couple things. One is, with a structure like this, you can build a joint probability model that the relationship among the x's can also tell you about their relationship with the theta. In particular, conditional probability distributions, given the theta, what are you likely to see? Now, you don't know what the theta is, but you can build a model if it were this. If theta in some trait value for reading comprehension were very high, you'd have high probabilities of making the right inferences. And more likely, if it's an easier text, easier inferences, less likely if it's a harder text, more challenging inferences, but you're estimating those conditional probabilities. Another thing you can do is you can show yourself that you're wrong. You can build this model about, if it were true, if there were some theta underlying that was driving probabilities, what would the patterns look like in the data? And you can go and look and see, how do they compare with the data that you actually have? And you can tell yourself, you can find out, oh, I've been wrong about this. Now, another thing that's good is that same way of thinking, I mentioned that factor analysis was another thing that came out of it. You could have more complex models with latent variables and look for patterns, structure, and what you can't see that are suggested by what the data say, but in a much noisier manner. So this is another great thing that you can do with these models, and another great thing about them, still using model fit tools that come out of probability, is see where all the nice theories that you had are wrong. And you can go back and get better data, or get a better model, or sometimes, worst comes to worst, get a better theory. Another thing that you can do with these is, from what you see, having estimated the structure, you can make inferences back to the things that you care about. And we use Bayes' theorem to do that. We talked about conditional probability distributions. What would you be likely to see for the x's if you knew the theta? We'll call those link functions. You can estimate those from the original data that you get, say a startup data set. You can also improve them along the way as you go along. But what that allows you to do then is, if you start out saying, well, what do I know before I see this kid give me any behavior, any responses at all? Well, your initial probability distribution for what their theta is might be pretty flat. You might not know much of anything. On the other hand, in some situations, you might know quite a bit. Any kid who is in this class already, Algebra 2, is only here because they've studied in Algebra 1. If you're in a tutoring system and you're on lesson 57, They're only in 57 because they've gone through 1 through 56. So there are a lot of things that you know already about what this kid knows, what they don't, where they're likely to be at their current understanding of what you're working on now and how that might change. So, make some observations, use Bayes' theorem, and you get an updated belief about what that theta is. You can get some more data, have even sharper distribution about what theta is, and more going on. So with this structure, a really nice thing about this that turns out to be really important for things like SimCity and other more complex assessment situations is that you can modularize your inference. You have these link functions. You have estimated, possibly through startup data, possibly through expert opinion, which is the fancy name for make it up, partly through your theory and the way you've constructed the kinds of actions that can take place in these situations, what those link functions might look like. And then you can hook them up as the situation in the world changes to absorb information. You can update your understanding about what the theta is, and then you can change the world to get, if it's assessment, better information. Someone is doing really well, you give them more challenging passage to read. If you're in a tutoring system, you get some idea about what lesson next, what tasks are most likely to improve what that theta value is. So this modularity turns out to be very important. This was one of the things that was hidden inside psychometric work back in the 1940s, when people were just inventing item response theory to do a better job making tests. The machinery that they developed to do a little bit better on things that they already could do pretty well had the seeds for doing things that they couldn't even dream of at that point. So real-time inference, real-time decisions. What's good about this probability inference is a metric for quantifying evidence, common framework for synthesizing observations from different people, model checking, and a conceptual framework that will take you further. Now here's that quote, the Sam Messick quote. I'll say a few words about each of those in the standard paradigm. Reliability started out replicate observations. The original classical test theory definition of reliability was a good thing telling you about the quality of your evidence for comparing different people. But what it was locked in is the population you had, and for inferences, comparing one person against another. So unlocking that would be important. Comparability, the way they did it then was making parallel tests. Very similar conditions as seen from the outside, not yet as seen from the inside. Generalizability, how much different would the answers be if you had different tasks, different raters evaluating them? There's another aspect of generalizability that I know is important because I've heard some of you talking about it or writing about it, and that is, all right, you have this model, you have these conclusions, and they look wonderful for this data set that we have from this class. Let's go to the same class in the next year and see if they hold up. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. What's going on? That's important. Validity. At the beginning, validity was seen as the correlation between whatever your estimate was, your theta estimate, and whatever you were trying to predict. It was a correlation. That's good. It's good if it's high, but it's not good enough. Validity has now come to be understood as what is the underlying body of evidence and theory that supports the inference you're making. Because correlations are not the same as causation. Correlations depend on whatever the social interactions and the social structure and the particular people you have. Those things change, the associations can change. If you make your reasoning through a fixed set of associations, you can be making invalid or unfair inferences about the next set or the next individual. Okay, all right, so I made the comment that one of the places where testing has fallen behind is psychology. Here's a quote from Jim Pellegrino that says this. I mean, I say it too, but it sounds more impressive if I say, this is what Jim Pellegrino said. So we're thinking about a more situative, sociocognitive view of psychology, confluence of ideas that come up from many, many disciplines, learning sciences, domain-based learning, anthropology, several branches of psychology, situated, social, cognitive. And one thing that's really important in it here is that we're looking at a person acting in a situation. And this is the kind of psychology that the original standard educational measurement paradigm lacked. Wasn't important for the jobs that it has, but it's essential for us if we're going to be doing something like SimCity EDU, because things are happening in the moment. People learn in the moment. This is how we need to think about psychology. We need to be able to build models, use ideas from data mining, from learning analytics, from psychometrics for problems that are now cast in a more sociocognitive vein. So here's a little bit what I mean by this. Here's this layer that is human level events as we understand them. Now it's interesting, you read the social psychology literature, linguistics and so on, and they'll tell you that what we experience is just the tip of an iceberg. There are all kinds of things that are happening at levels above, patterns that are just regularities in interactions among people. Things like language, all different grain sizes, just from the sounds that I'm making, the sentences, to how they fit into the discourse that we're having, how that interacts with how we're supposed to be behaving when we're in a situation like this. At any moment, we're assembling pieces that are coming from many, many cultural extra-person patterns that are shared, not among everybody, but among people who interact personally or through books or watching the same TV shows. Those are the things that we make meaning of that allow us to do very complicated things like build buildings, or all show up here more or less at 8:30. So becoming competent means becoming attuned to what those patterns are, recognizing them when you see them. Now, how does that happen? Well, this is the cognitive and the sociocognitive part. What happens within people? That's also where I've seen the iceberg metaphor, that what we experience as human events is just the tip of the iceberg with all the cognition that is going on, all of the assembly, moment by moment, of patterns. Resources is a useful word that I found in a couple different domains to talk about. Assembling resources to understand a situation, to know what to do, to act. There are many, many of those things going on in everything we do. That becomes important in assessment because every one of those is a place that you can go wrong. You can have this wonderful assessment about reading comprehension, worked really hard writing the tasks, defining the inferences that are the targets, but they're all in English, and here's a person who doesn't know English, and that test is going to tell you absolutely nothing. If you infer that this person has poor reading comprehension abilities, you're making a big mistake. And it was because of one of the assumptions that went in, and that person might have great reading comprehension abilities, but in the circumstances and the social milieu, it was in a rather different language. So they have capabilities that might be called the same word as we see it externally, but internally they have rather different resources that they're bringing to bear. Okay, another comment is that data live in the middle, and what we're trying to do is to make sense of what we see in events in terms of what's happening cognitively, for individuals as they become attuned to those patterns and what's happening, what are the patterns that are important to learn about. Many of these we learn quite naturally, our first language as we learn it. Others take a lot of work and very specifically, like the notations, the concepts, representations of systems thinking. So these things are important because as people move through the world, the various patterns that they become attuned to depend on the situations they move through. We can leverage this for learning. We also need to be aware of that for when we make assessment. What are we assuming that is going on that will influence performance but may be ancillary to what we're interested in? Okay, so what, from that point of view, is important to know about people? Well, just in situations, whatever the targeted patterns are, like the systems thinking, what's important to notice? What will happen next? How do I make sense of it? How do I think about it? What can I do next? So what does this imply for assessment? Well, it says that what capabilities are about isn't just knowing a bunch of stuff. Yeah, you probably have to know some stuff, but what's really important is being able to use that in situations to do things. And so that tells us something about the nature of capabilities that we care about, and it also tells us something that at least some of the time we want to make observations in something like SimCity EDU where people are doing things in the environment. Another project that I've worked on a lot with Cisco is actually doing troubleshooting of networks. Just knowing all the terminology, knowing the 7-layer system isn't enough. Interacting with other people and with computer systems to get work done. So it also changes what we think those thetas mean as well. What do we think of constructs? Well, we no longer think that those, well, I no longer think. If you took a poll of psychometricians, where are constructs? Are they in the head of the examinee or are they in the head of the analyst? I would guess right now it's about 1/3 who would say in the head of the analyst. That's where I think they are. Still 2/3 maybe think it's in the head of the student, which is not entirely bad because as a model you can do a lot of useful things. I just don't think you ought to believe it. So what we're really thinking about, what do I think those thetas are? I think those are clusters of capabilities, resources that people might have that for shorthand, it's a situation in terms of what people are doing and sufficient similarities in their backgrounds rule out a lot of alternative explanations. If they share enough background knowledge that's necessary, I can do some pretty useful work with a relatively simple model, working as if it were in the heads of the people, even though I know it's not. They're in those kinds of models, you have to think about them. Each person, they're idiosyncratic. They're, even those larger linguistic, cognitive, or cultural linguistic patterns, they change over time. They're contingent, they're local in time, local among associations and people, so that's going to affect how far and for what purposes the models that you have travel. Okay, and what does it mean for tasks? Well, they're going to be more like SimCity. We would like to be able to observe people in things that look a lot different than those standard prepackaged tasks. Here are a couple of them. A big one here is continuous activity. We can't just think about scoring responses. We need to think about characterizing evidence in situations. That way of thinking about it works for traditional standard educational measurement paradigm and tasks, but it's the only thing that works when you move to things that are more complex. Okay, structure of arguments, you want to make some sort of claim about students, that's in terms of a construct, and you have some data. And what people usually think about data is that flat file. The reason that you can make that inference is you have some warrant about that. What we think about that now is a warrant in terms of people had some level of competency with various of these linguistic, cultural, substantive patterns that are the targets. they're more likely to be able to figure out what's going on in the Jackson City challenge, for example. Now you back up a minute, those data don't just appear. What actually happens is a student is acting in a situation and you have to figure out what is meaningful, what is important to your job. So this little arrow right here, there are a lot of things that go into that, and we'll come back to that. But what we're looking for is cues, patterns in people's actions that tell us something about the capabilities that we're interested in. Those actions only make sense in terms of the situations that they are in. So just as important as data is what people do is the situations that they're in also. When tasks are written back at the factory, all those things were implicit in the minds of the test developers. When we're looking at SimCity EDU, those are features of situations as they evolve through the interactions. So the targeted linguistic, cultural, substantive patterns also are important in identifying in where that person is acting. I'll mention that all of this is in some framework as we're looking at it. What the student is doing is as the student is looking at it, which may or may not be the same thing. Here's that example where we have a reading comprehension test and it's in English and the student doesn't know any English, just knows Tagalog. And so those situations are not the same. There's not enough correspondence between the situation as they see it and we see it for our inference through this argument structure to be sound. We need to think about, be aware of alternative explanations for poor performance, and there are a lot more than the ones from the simple argument that we have in mind. Sometimes we're in the fortunate situation of having other information that can help us condition our inference or can help us restructure the situation. For example, we might say, oh, okay, you don't speak English. We have a tag-along version of this test, so we're going to have you making inferences too that are the same level in Walter Kinch's CI theory of reading comprehension, except with background knowledge and structures that you're familiar with, and we're going to see what you can do in that environment. It's a different specific environment, but it will give us some information about the capabilities that we care about. So you see already that's really different from the traditional assessment is fair if it's identical for every person. Now it's fair if it might be different on the surface for different people, but different in ways that give us better evidence about what we really care about. Okay, so that kind of picture is fine for an argument structure. For a static test, multiple choice item, what's happening when you're doing something like SimCity U is it's continuous. So things happen, you move immediately to a new situation, and that new situation depends on what just happened and what just the kid had done, and now what happens again. And so you've got moving arguments as they go along, and it's continuous. So we're looking at something like this for an argument structure. So we'll look a little bit later about what structures look like for modeling this. So basically, when we look at those, when we map it back to those psychometric-y kind of pieces, we'll have some of these variables that stand for constructs. Now I've got several of them here rather than just one, and that's because several aspects of knowledge about different things, some of the cultural patterns, some of the activity patterns, are involved jointly and in different combinations, maybe. So those are claims we want to make about. We'll have to sort out evidence from those. And the link functions, we'll have different link functions that go along with different recurring structures of situations that in different mixes and for different reasons give us some evidence tapping different aspects of their knowledge and ability. So we'll be able to hook those up on the fly. Now there are these reasoning back from what is happening in a unique human situation, both what's important in the action and what's important in the situation. So that's where computational psychometrics is. We'll get back to that in a minute, but I'll say just a few words about some of the kinds of assessments that we're needing to think this way about. There's the SimCity EDU one up in the upper right-hand corner. This is packet tracer, simulation environments for troubleshooting and configuring computer networks. The one on the lower left, that's a trialogue, or actually tetralogue. It's a takeoff, building on some of the work of Art Gracer and his colleagues with their auto tutor work. You can use that for assessment, where a kid is interacting with some avatars in a conversation about volcanoes. And in one way, it seems like it's more open and more realistic, more free choice. But in another way, because it is a constructed conversation, including two avatars, you can actually make it more informative. You're focusing what that situation is in a way that feels more natural to the kid, yet gets better access to what the kid is thinking. You can ask things like, well, I'm not sure what you mean. What exactly did the teacher say we need to do? And follow up in ways that if it's a single shot response, you just don't get. And then in the lower right-hand corner, this is another example of an interactive simulation environment. Janice Gobert, Brian Baker worked on this. It's another example where the iterative design, the interplay, Janice Gobert had been studying science inquiry for years. What was built into the interface really focused on what's happening in the situation, what can kids do so that it is at the same time true to the scientific problem, and because the choices, the options, give you good clues about what the kid is thinking, what the strategies are, what they learned from what they've done. So yeah, you get rich data, you have tons of data, you do data mining, and it comes out with strong patterns that tell you about the thinking. But it's not just because the data mining was so wonderful, although it is, no offense, Ryan, but it's in interplay with the design, and it's the interplay between the two of them that is much more powerful than either one is by itself. Okay, so I'll skip through a couple of these and go through to the cooler slides. Okay, this is one, you know those two arrows, and I put the big red circle around there about what's happening and identifying what are the features of the situation, what are the features of the performance that are important. Well, in something like SimCity EDU, something like trialogues, something like interactive conversation where the data that you're getting might be some spoken utterances, but also body language. Let's see, that one there in the middle looks kind of like night vision, so might have that kind of data as well. Those are the very lowest level of data. Low-level features in those have some meaning syntactically, like little sounds that we're making come together in certain patterns and they make words. Words fit together in sentences that, if we're lucky, sometimes mean something. What they mean takes place in a discourse. So you have these patterns of layers of meaning. So you might have several of these that are necessary. Your understanding of the domain, what's important in the situations from whatever the targeted patterns are, what do people need to recognize, how do they need to think about it. All those things are going on, and we can leverage those to make sense of what's happening in the environment. And again, I'll say, because of the importance of this interaction back and forth among the theory about the design of the situations and the theory in knowing what to look for really leverages the capabilities of whatever analytics and whatever data mining you have. Now here's how it plays out in the SimCity example. At the very top, what we have is the theta over there is a construct that has to do with level of thinking in a learning progression for systems thinking. It starts out being able to reason just simple cause and effects, moves up to events might have multiple effects in them. Bulldozing a power plant is a good example of that. You knock down all the old coal plants and you lower pollution, but also all the lights go out and everybody leaves from the city, and that's not good. So you have to come to realize that that's going on and take actions that recognize the multiple effects and what you can do about that. So what do you actually see a kid doing? At the lowest level, all you're getting is a kid interacting with this screen, and you get some mouse clicks at various times and durations of hovers and moves around there. In and of itself, it means nothing at all. The first level up from that, you can interpret those in terms of what in the game world they call verbs. This kid is bulldozing a power plant. There might be several ways you can do that. The particular low-level actions all have this higher level meaning about bulldoze a power plant. So that is the next kind of thing that you're trying to understand. Then you look at patterns in those, and they tell you something about strategies or lack of strategies. For example, before you bulldoze an old power plant, have you put up a new one and gotten that online so that when you bulldoze it, you won't have a drop in power that causes loss of jobs? And all of these things are moving up, and we'll see a little bit more in the next slide how that looks when you start to program this. This is the identification of evidence from a given performance at a given point in time. And it's up at this level that we say, okay, now we have at a high enough level, these are strategic, these are psychologically relevant. This might be a level where I'll hook it in with a probability model so that at this layer, I can have my thetas, my constructs that have to do with the higher level aspects of system understanding or of jobs and pollution, my relative handful of those that will be maintained as the kid works through, and I will update with rather different kinds of processing going on underneath. So, okay, in SimCity EDU, it was summary functions of counts and patterns of these kinds of strategic actions that we ended up putting into the Bayes net. This is one of the patterns that Kristen DeSerbo, who's been at some of the LAK conferences, worked on, and finding, let's see, along the top row, these are kids that at the end of a given trial, they got the pollution way down, but the ones way over on the left also had jobs up. The way over on the right, no pollution, no jobs. Lower left, still had jobs, but no pollution. So, or let's see, no, I'm sorry. Still had jobs, still had lots of pollution. So it's only in the upper left hand that those kids had figured out ways to get to a solution that maintained them both. Okay, so what we did up at this level is we had a Bayes net psychometric model, and we're able to hook things up as we went along. So what does that look like? Looks kind of like this. These are the student model, the thetas there. This is a library of these fragments of link functions that are set up to, in certain recurring kinds of situations that come up, they're always unique, but they come up in a recurring way. We know in a situation like that, it's going to require some kinds of thinking about the system or about the jobs or the current state. That's what we want to update. How do we do that? Well, we have some flow of activity in the game. And game designers, the way they made SimCity, is they have a state machine. There's a state vector about what's important. They have a state vector, and in SimCity, the real SimCity, there's like a couple thousand variables in that. And what we're going to do is piggyback on that. We're going to have some variables, some of which they already have in there, many of which they don't, that are psychologically relevant. Features of the situation that we know tag certain recurrent configurations of situation and what has happened before, that now we're going to get a bit of evidence about a kid, how they're thinking about that system. So what we've got is we have this layer of evidence-bearing opportunity detectors, and that is agents that look for certain configurations popping up in certain of these variable features of situations. And when you recognize, when you say, oh, here's an opportunity to see whether this kid recognizes that this action is going to have multiple effects or not. I'm ready to see what this kid is going to be doing next. So when these feature detectors come upon, when they see in the ocean of data an evidence-bearing opportunity, then they know, okay, we can hook up our routines for interpreting what happens next. Good thing about the probability, the modular construction of this, is that you can increase your library of evidence-bearing opportunities as you continue to do more feedback back and forth, updating the interfaces, updating the evidence-bearing opportunity detectors, increasing the amount of evidence that you get. Okay, I'll skip through a couple examples. They're all pretty cool, but it's all pretty much the same thing all the time. One or two pictures that you guys have probably seen. Meng Zhao, in fact, made this picture here. This is some more of this interaction back and forth. There are experts, humans, who are rating the solution that kids had to solving simple troubleshooting of a pump, and she was looking at networks that describe the patterns of actions people took, and looking at how characteristics of networks related to what the judges were coming up with implicitly in their heads. And it's ways like this that you can say, we can move toward automated scoring, we can scale up, we can see where there are ambiguities, we can go back and improve the item in the interface in the automated scoring. Other kinds of psychometric models that you can have. And I'll hit again these social values. Reliability, when you have something like a Bayes net or a structured item response theory multidimensional model up at this higher level, a good thing about it is that you can characterize the amount of information that you're getting, the amount of evidence. I've had interesting, discussion. They're somewhere between conversations and arguments about whether reliability is important in formative assessment. And I half agree with that in the sense that if you're doing things that are formative, you have quick opportunities for changing what you're doing. Reliability in the classical sense is not nearly so important as when you have much less information, high stakes decisions. But on the other hand, I disagree in saying, why would you ever say you don't want a framework that will ever allow you to characterize and quantify the evidence that you have? It's really important in design, if you're ever going to be doing A/B testing about which of these designs gives me better evidence, how are you going to know that unless you can characterize the evidence that you're getting? So even if you're doing formative assessment, having these metrics and a probability framework will help you improve what you're doing over time. Might make you sad when the things that you believe very strongly turn out not to be true. From the point of view of the community, that's a good thing. Comparability and fairness, I'll just mention here that what's really important now in the way that we're thinking about this situative, sociocognitive point of view, what is fairness isn't necessarily identical observation situations for everybody, but they're situations that might be different on the surface, and they're tailored in principal ways to people's background knowledge, or maybe their interest, or maybe to the first language that they spoke, so that what the focus is on can condition on all of those things and really point their learning or the evidence in the assessment use toward whatever the targeted constructs are that you want to assess or you want to help them learn more. And I'll say about validity too. Validity, one of the things I've been happy to see in a lot of what I've read and what I've heard here is pressing on where my beliefs and where my models might go wrong. Replicability, using different structures, different techniques. Do I get similar answers or not? If you have triangulation, similar kinds of structures, similar kinds of answers in different courses, you're happier about that. You have some robustness. If you get different answers, you probably better not believe any one of them is true. Okay, here's conclusion. Key ideas that are coming out of past and current work in psychometrics. Values of probability-based reasoning. There are a lot of things you can't do with it, but it's a framework that for certain kinds of things, especially characterizing evidence and being able to do this real time, turns out to be very handy for certain kinds of problems that we deal with. Another is this situative sociocognitive perspective. Framing your targets of inference in learning in these ways is necessary, I would claim, for the kinds of moment-by-moment interactions that are heart of simulation, interactive assessments, as well as learning systems. This assessment as measurement paradigm has a lot of power to it, but you have to realize that that's just model-based reasoning. All models are wrong. The question is, are you using one that within its limits is useful or is it not? Models also are nested within assessment as argument. Things that are not in the model are essential for model working. The contextualization, the span of people that you're working with. So all of those things, even above, are nested within a social context as well. That's where you're going to need to think about things like fairness and validity, continually checking your assumptions from different directions. So validity, reliability, comparability, generalizability, fairness, these are really important things. We found that probability models in some of the work that we do helps us address them rigorously, and we're learning how to take very specific ways of doing that that grew up in the standard educational measurement paradigm and bust them out of there to help us with a wider range of problems. This dialectic between design and discovery is very important for learning ourselves, for our understanding of what we're doing, and for improving the work that we do, the products that we have, and the effects that they have on kids and on education. And finally, I'll mention computational psychometrics. I am a mentor to the Computational Psychometrics Research Center. One of our first jobs is to figure out what that phrase means. But I think it has something to do with bringing together these ideas from psychometrics with learning analytics, learning science, and data mining. So, thank you.
Well, we have just about 8 or 9 minutes for questions, and then you will have an extended opportunity for questions with Bob in the next session. There's one parallel session that's for follow-up questions. But who would like to ask the first question?
Fantastic talk, thank you so much. The field of psychometrics has a lot to offer learning analytics community, and your points about theory and assessment design were much needed. Could you say some about the transition practitioners, educators could take that would be conducive to better assessment design? Because this is a little beyond your current scope, which focuses on grades.
Absolutely, and I would say if I were going to do just one thing to improve assessment, it probably wouldn't be with models or probability-based reasoning at all, but better situations that are more true to the targets of learning that we have in mind. When I reviewed papers from learning analytics, it was very interesting to see the span of what was in there. Some of what I saw was a little bit more like SimCity EDU, where there was a challenge to the kinds of understanding and the capabilities that were being developed. And that was really great. Other things that I saw were the same items that were used 100 years ago for the learning and for the criterion. And I was not very happy about that. I think a system to do that much more efficiently with that as your targets of learning and your criteria helps get us faster to where we wanted to be in 1945. But we need to do better than that. So I think learning analytics, as the move continues to a richer understanding of our targets of learning and the environments and the data, some of it is happening. You look around projects and there's a huge variety of the assumptions about the nature of competence and learning that underlie much of this work. So, and I would say too, when people ask me about how to improve practice in the classrooms, I say rather than reading my stuff, they should read Grant Wiggins' stuff. Grant Wiggins talks about reverse design when you think about what is it that you'd really like your kids to be able to do. Well, okay, don't start by building a test that asks them to do something else. You work backwards, and that will be your assessment, but that will also tell you what kids are going to have to be doing to get there. So if you've got the right situations and the right activities along the way, you can use classical test theory to get most of the information out there, but it's the right information about the right stuff at the right time, and that's way more important than the models that you're building. The hardest nut to crack is that policymakers, their view of assessment and learning is still pretty much stuck in 1945. And the biggest successes that I have ever had have been outside the educational machine. Things like the Cisco Networking Academy, things like AP Studio Art, which you can sneak in because the people in the central office really don't care about that. But that is much richer experience, much better assessment. And right now, I drive down the street where my kids went to high school, and I know there are at least 2 rooms in there. The one with the Cisco Network Academy, the one with AP Studio Art, where they're thinking about learning and assessment in the way we're talking about it here, even though many other classes weren't. So I have to get it up from 2 classes to 3 to 37. Maybe all of them, I don't know. But that's hard. That's hard.
And another question. Good.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to ask you your views about non-standard data and the value of non-standard data going forward for this area. And just so you see where I'm coming from, I work on a literature that has to do with predicting decisions and understanding all of what you're saying about human decision making.
Yes.
And in that area, there is a whole community of people that broadly called neuromarketers that are very interested in knowing, for example, if I see your eye movements or your facial expressions, could Amazon predict your preferences and get you to buy better, things like that. And the state of the art in that world, I would summarize, is that there is predictive information in that data, but not if you control for what we can predict with psychometrics. So there is not additional predictive value. So is there something similar? Is the state of the art here similar that there is yet no demonstration that adding this kind of data to the type of models that you have shown with more standard data works? And what are your views for the future?
Yeah. And I would say yes, and it's different than marketing uses. Where marketing, you look for prediction. And why it predicts, who cares? We sell more product, you buy more books at Amazon, I don't know. Whatever information you can use, you do better. When you're doing assessment, there is partly our own desire and partly this reasoning about fairness to have some rationale. Paul talked about this yesterday a bit. If you're using a model, you can go with lower prediction for higher validity. And the reason for that is prediction based on association is prediction based on correlations. Correlations change in different communities over time. You can have predictions that are a little bit better overall, but they're worse for individuals. When we're thinking about education, we would like to have predictions where even if we can't get the exact rationale, if you're using a neural net to summarize some information, you can't say exactly how that combination goes, but you ought to have a story for why each of those features going in there has some relevance to what you care about. And if you don't, my predilection is to not have it. Now, places where I know that this kind of non-standard data has had useful impact, one of my colleagues at ETS, Saad Khan, who we stole from SRI, sorry, his background is in computer vision, and some of his projects have been in cultural understanding. And non-standard data in that world would be things like gaze, things like body motion, proximity, and all of those have real relevance, as you can see from ethnomethodological studies about communications in different cultures. What is meaningful clues, what is not, what you do and how you stand. So that's a case where it's non-standard data, but we have very good rationale for using it, and in fact, it informs feedback. So non-standard data, especially if you have some rationale for using it, we're now developing machinery to know how to use it.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more quick question. Great.
Hi, despite the emphasis on social, cultural dimensions and the impact that can have, I don't think I heard the word self-report anywhere. Do you have strong views about self-report data?
Some. In SimCity EDU, there was a certain amount of self-report that was really essential to developing that project, because at the same time we wanted to give good opportunity of learning, we wanted to give it evidence for assessment, but we also wanted it to be engaging as an experience as well. So kids self-report as to, would you like to play this again? Or would you tell your friends to play it? Or what parts were fun, which were dull, where did you get stuck? Those self-reports were very useful. Other self-reports about what were you thinking when you did this, those were less useful. Let's see, who was it? I think maybe it was Paul again who mentioned it too. Human events are the tip of the iceberg. There are some kinds of things that we can give pretty good accurate self-reports to as we experience them, as we think about them consciously. There are lots of other things that are going on that we don't understand consciously. We're happy to give answers, but we're just making them up. So I don't believe those. And I would say when you get to these higher order skills like Angela Duckworth in Grit, that's a very popular one now. People self-report on those. She had a recent article which basically said to people, whoa, slow down. She has done study in persistence, in grit, and getting some usefulness out of self-reports for kids. Do you stick with things or not? They're very noisy, but there are some patterns that she's found useful. Where she said slow down is that some educational policymakers said, oh, grit is important. Let's have assessments of grit. Let's evaluate teachers about how much they've increased grit in their class this year. And we'll get self-reports of kids for how much their grit is at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. And that's a very terrible idea. So self-report certainly has its role in research. When it comes to any sorts of high-stakes decisions, I would take it off the table.
Thank you so much, Bob. And please thank you one more time.